Hello, it is Monday, the 9th of January 2023. I'm continuing to excavate my purchases from Vintage Laserdiscs in South Australia, so here we go. All right, so here we have a 1990 Japanese Warner Home Video Laserdisc of Lethal Weapon 2, the action comedy starring Mel Gibson and Danny Glover, and directed by Richard Donner. Okay, yeah, this is a really good film. I really like Lethal Weapon 2. It's sort of I like, of all the Lethal Weapon movies, there was four of them. The first two are the best. I sort of go back and forth as to which one I prefer between the first and the second one. I'd probably go for the first one, but it's such a slim margin that really, if someone told me they like Lethal Weapon 2 more than the first one, I wouldn't, I wouldn't really have a problem with that. I suspect that when people think of Lethal Weapon, they as a series or Lethal Weapon as a movie, they're probably more likely to think of Lethal Weapon 2. I think this is the one that's sort of become most emblematic of the whole saga. So the original Lethal Weapon was from 1987. It was written by Shane Black. It was a big success. Made a lot of money. Did well with the critics as well. And then, no surprise, Warner Brothers wanted to do a sequel, which they did a couple of years later. So this came out in 1989, which. At the time, 1989 was a pretty interesting year. It doesn't really mean anything today because the cinema landscape has changed so much. But at the time, 1989, a lot of people were bemused by the fact that so many sequels were released in 1989. It really wasn't, it wasn't as commonplace back then as it is these days. So, I mean, in 1989 alone, there was Lethal Weapon 2, Back to the Future 2, Ghostbusters 2, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. There was also Karate Kid 2, Star Trek 5. What else? License to Kill, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, Fletch Lives. I think there was Eddie and the Cruisers too. And then there was also like horror movies like Halloween 5, Nightmare on Elm Street 5, Friday the 13th Part 8, The Fly 2. I think at the time, 1989 probably set the record for most number of sequels in one calendar year. That being said, the biggest movie of 1989 was Tim Burton's Batman, which wasn't a sequel in of itself, but, it led to sequels later on. This was one of the big ones. This is one of the more successful ones. It definitely it ramps up the comedy. I think the first Lethal Weapon was written by Shane Black, and it was much more of a straight action movie that had some amusing moments in it. Whereas Lethal Weapon 2, it's still a pretty much a straightforward action movie, but it sort of leans towards, I guess, the sort of ridiculousness a little bit more than the sequel did, or I mean, a lot more than the first film did, really, because I mean, it literally starts off with the Looney Tunes fanfare, if memory serves. So this is the one where Riggs and Murtaugh, played by Mel Gibson and Danny Glover, go up against this nefarious gang of criminals from South Africa who are, operating under the protection of diplomatic immunity. And so, yeah, one of the things that I find so hilarious about Lethal Weapon 2, sort of unintentionally hilarious, is the way that, so this was 1989, so South Africa, it was still, the apartheid regime. So this film was, to an extent, it was making a political statement, but it's just kind of ridiculous the way that the movie presents these criminals from South Africa as basically cold-bloodedly murdering like scores of LA police officers, and yet the police forces, we can't do anything, we can't risk antagonizing South Africa, we could create a international situation. And it's like, I don't know. I kind of think that I don't think South Africa in the late 1980s, I don't think it was like, the Soviet Union or North Korea these days. Like, I'm pretty sure, you couldn't tiptoe around South Africa and just let South Africans just, straight up murder your citizens. But, I don't know. It's still an entertaining movie. This is the film that introduced the character of Leo Getz, played by Joe Pesci, to the series, and he's pretty good in this. He's pretty funny in this. They kept bringing the character back in the sequels, even though he didn't really have much reason to be there. But he's good in this, and this is for all of my quibbling criticisms, this Lethal Weapon 2, it's still an entertaining movie. Talking about the film's ridiculousness, this is the one that has the rather infamous set piece of Roger Murtaugh risking, his life being threatened by, an explosive that's attached to his toilet. But yeah, there's some really good, there's some really good action sequences in this, and some good humor, and I think this was Richard Donner at his crowd pleasing popcorn entertainment blockbusting best. So the original screenplay for Lethal Weapon 2 was written by Shane Black, who'd written the original Lethal Weapon, although it was extensively rewritten by other writers. I think Richard Donner, I don't think he entirely was on board with Shane Black's approach. I think Shane, if memory serves, Shane Black's original Lethal Weapon 2 script was called Play Dirty, and I think it was a lot darker than the film. I think Richard Donner and the writers he got to rewrite the film, I think they lightened the film. They lightened it up quite a bit. I think Shane Black was sort of approaching the movie from the storytelling angle, whereas Richard Donner was approaching it from the continuing franchise angle, which is why he made it a lot more crowd pleasing, and also I think he figured that killing off Mel Gibson's Martin Riggs at the end of the movie wasn't really going to ensure the viability of future Lethal Weapon sequels. This is a CIC Japanese Laserdisc of Brian De Palma's The Untouchables. So CIC Video, for the better part of the 80s, in fact, I think for all of the 80s, CIC handled international distribution of films made by Paramount and Universal. The Untouchables in this case was a Paramount film. So The Untouchables from 1987, directed by Brian De Palma, of course, one of my favorite filmmakers. So yeah, Brian De Palma, he had this phase throughout the 80s where he would sort of bounce back and forth between box office hits and then films that didn't do too well. So in 1980, he made Dressed to Kill, which was a huge hit, though controversial. After that, in 1981, he did Blowout, which might be his best film, but it was a bit of a box office flop. He did Scarface in 1983, which was a massive hit. Then he did Body Double in 1984, which wasn't I don't think did too well. And then I think it was 85 or 86 he did Wise Guys with Joe Pesci and Joe Piscopo, and it's not a very good movie. And then he did The Untouchables in 87, and this kind of got Brian De Palma back on the A list. So this was kind of a very prestigious looking like period gangster / action movie. So you've got Kevin Costner, sort of at the the dawn of his career as a viable leading man, playing Elliot Ness, the Treasury agent assigned to take on Al Capone, the gangster, played in this film by Robert De Niro in 1930 Chicago. So it's Depression era, Prohibition, etc. And Elliot Ness sort of recruits a team of incorruptible cops. Sean Connery as the old Irish cop, Jimmy Malone, Charles Martin Smith as the he's the Treasury accountant, Oscar Wallace, and Andy Garcia as George Stone, and they take Capone on. So this is a film that is sort of interesting for me. This is another film where my feelings about it have sort of changed. Like, for years, when I was younger, and for many years afterwards, this is one of my all-time favorite movies. I love this movie. I watched it all the time. I could not get enough of this. The direction, the classic dialogue, the Ennio Morricone music. It just had so many great atmospheric scenes, like lots of action, etc. I've sort of these days, I'm not really as kindly disposed towards The Untouchables. It's sort of there are things about this movie that really, really bug me. So yeah, I think it's just I've sort of gotten used to the fact that it bears practically no resemblance to the real life events it ostensibly portrays. Elliot Ness and Al Capone. It just flat out bullshits so much, which is okay, I suppose. That's all right. But I think some of the things that really bug me, just like the climactic courtroom sequence where they get Capone by they uncover his jury tampering, and then the judge orders the bailiff to switch juries with another trial. And it's like, yeah, I don't think you can just switch a jury in the middle of a trial and keep the trial going. And then you've got Capone's lawyer substituting, putting in a guilty plea for Capone without even conferring with Capone, or Capone even agreeing to it. Like, it's like a fantasy land where nothing in this courtroom sort of comports to any real legal procedure. David Mamet, who wrote the script of this, if you look at a lot of the stuff he's written, he seems to have a very tenuous grasp of the judicial world, or the legal world, or whatever. He just sort of, even the verdict has got some very, very dubious legalistic stuff in it. I do like a lot of the dialogue that David Mamet wrote for this, especially the dialogue that's delivered in a very over-the-top fashion by Robert De Niro. Like when De Niro is really chewing the scenery, saying stuff like, "You ain't got nothing, you hear me? You got nothing in court? You ain't got the bookkeeper? You got nothing! Nothing!" Stuff like that. And there's this really fantastic production design. You've got the Giorgio Armani costumes. You've got the famous set pieces, like the gunfight on the steps, stuff like that. There's a lot of good things in this movie. I sort of think I read somewhere someone describing it as it's not so much a prestige gangster movie as kind of a dumb 80s action movie in 1930s period garb, and I think there's some truth to that. So having a look inside, so here this is a gatefold, and it's got interestingly it's got a picture of the real Al Capone there. That's not Robert De Niro. So yeah, this is probably like historical stuff. I don't speak Japanese, so I don't quite know. But they really go to some effort, making these things look good, don't they? This is a 1988 Japanese laserdisc from Warner Home Video for the movie Clute, the 1971 neo-noir mystery thriller starring Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland. Clute. This is a really good film. It's the first installment of 3 movies directed by Alan J. Pakula that are sort of informally referred to as his Paranoia trilogy. So you had Clute in 1971, The Parallax View in 1974, and finally All the President's Men in 1976. None of the movies, have any narrative or any real thematic connections, but it's really just about atmosphere. All 3 movies are really, really good. So this movie, Clute. So this came out in 1971. Jane Fonda plays a high class call girl who assists a small town detective played by Donald Sutherland in this missing persons case, and they get sort of dragged into this situation involving murders and stuff. So Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland are both really good in this film. Jane Fonda actually won an Academy Award for Best Actress for this movie, which was very well deserved. And Donald Sutherland didn't win. It wasn't even nominated. In fact, I think that's a very strange and in its way kind of shocking piece of trivia attached to Donald Sutherland, is that not only has he never won an Academy Award, he's never been nominated competitively for an Academy Award, not ever. That's just that I still find that really, really baffling. But so this is a good movie. Roy Scheider is in this too. It's sort of a relatively early screen role for Roy Scheider, and he's good in this. So yeah. This is a 1991 Japanese laserdisc for the movie RoboCop 2, released by RCA Columbia International Video. So the movie's from 1990. This laserdisc is from 1991. I have talked a little bit about RoboCop 2 in a previous video in the context of talking about RoboCop 3. So the original RoboCop, released in 1987, is one of my favorite films. It's a fantastic film, directed by Paul Verhoeven. RoboCop 2 came along a couple of years later in 1990, and I have to be honest, I really don't like RoboCop 2 much at all. It was directed by Irvin Kershner, who directed The Empire Strikes Back, but there's just so many things with this movie that really annoy me. It's got this very it really tries to be as gleefully satirical as the first movie was, but it just doesn't really make it. It just has this kind of mean-spirited edge to it. I think it's got this sort of I guess a nihilism that doesn't really work. It's got this like attempts at comedy, like there's this whole subplot of RoboCop sort of being rendered polite that sort of doesn't really add much to the movie, and it's not especially funny, and it just goes on for a while. And then you have the villains in this. I love Tom Noonan. He's one of my favorite actors, but his character in this, I don't know, it just doesn't really work for me. And then you have this bizarre situation where the OCP is having trouble replicating RoboCop and having other RoboCops, I guess. And then they decide to, implant the brain of a, deranged, delusional drug addicted psychopath into a robot body, and then they're surprised when the robot goes crazy and starts wreaking havoc. I mean, it's a movie where, I don't know, it's just not very well written. Peter Weller does his best in this. This is his second and final appearance as RoboCop. He didn't appear in RoboCop 3, ostensibly because he was filming David Cronenberg's Naked Lunch at the time. But I have a suspicion that after this one, Peter Weller had just had enough of schlepping around in the cumbersome costume. This movie, it's got some good things in it. It relies a lot more on stop motion animation than the first movie did. So unfortunately, a lot of the climactic material in this movie, it tends to resemble like an extended episode of Robot Chicken. It's a little ridiculous, but it's not a film I go back to very often, to be perfectly honest. And I have said this before, I do prefer RoboCop 3 to RoboCop 2. I mean, they're both dubious movies, but I just find RoboCop 3 a little bit more enjoyable. So Bonnie and Clyde, the movie from 1967. This is a Warner Home Video Laserdisc from 1987, so 20 years later. So Bonnie and Clyde. It's what can you say about this movie? It's a justifiably regarded as a classic. In star-making appearances by Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway as Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, the criminal couple that go on a rampage through central USA in the Depression era in the 1930s. I really like this movie. It's a sort of beyond the movie itself. It's kind of historically important. In the history of cinema. This is the movie that kind of kick-started what is generally referred to as the New Hollywood. The sort of golden age of American filmmaking in the 1970s. And it was also quite a this movie was a big hit, and it kind of was it, like Warner Brothers, the studio that made it, like they weren't really doing especially well at the time, and this movie was a big hit for them, and it kind of pointed the way for sustained success and sustained quality that Warner Brothers enjoyed for pretty much all of the 1970s up until and throughout the 80s as well. It was like the 1970s in particular, like Warner Brothers was just that studio was just churning out just great movies one after another, and this kind of presaged that. So you've got Warren Beatty, Faye Dunaway. You've also got Michael J. Pollard. Early appearances by Gene Hackman and Gene Wilder. They're both really good in this. Written by David Newman and Robert Benton. The movie was quite controversial for its very, very violent climax, the fate of Bonnie and Clyde at the end, which was for its time it was quite explicitly bloody. But yeah, this is a good film, very very atmospheric, very well made. Amazingly enough, Francois Truffaut was attached to direct this at an earlier point. I wonder what that would have been like. But it's directed by Arthur Penn, who obviously after this he went on to make even more great movies, including Little Big Man. But this is probably his best movie. This is a 1983 Japanese Laserdisc from Warner Home Video for Martin Scorsese's New York, New York, originally released by United Artists in 1977. New York, New York. It's an interesting film. It's very much a variation on A Star Is Born. In 1954, Judy Garland starred in the second film version of A Star Is Born, and then her daughter Liza Minnelli many years later starred in this, which is kind of it's very much indebted to A Star Is Born. So in this you have it's set in the 1940s, and you have Liza Minnelli as a young singer who begins a relationship with a jazz saxophonist, Jimmy Doyle, played by Robert De Niro, and it's about their sort of tempestuous relationship and their careers sort of going in different, like, opposite trajectories. So very much like A Star Is Born in that regard. So this is a bit of a cult film. New York, New York. It wasn't a hit at the time. It actually ended Martin Scorsese's hot streak. He directed Mean Streets in 1973, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore in 1974, and then Taxi Driver in 1976. And then he made this movie, and it didn't do very well at all. It was sort of there was it was part, I guess, of all these new Hollywood directors that were sort of making musicals that didn't do especially well. Like Peter Bogdanovich did the same thing with They All Laughed, and later on Francis Ford Coppola did One from the Heart. But yeah, this is a good film. It's not without its flaws, but it's still pretty enjoyable. I feel it probably deserved better than it got at the time. The film was actually edited by the studio for its original release, and then in 1981 there was a musical number that was restored to it. So this is 163 minutes. This version. So this is the full version of the film, which is good. There's an interesting piece of trivia attached to this movie. It's that it was co-produced by Irwin Winkler, and he had the idea of doing a sequel, like exploring Robert De Niro's character and what Robert De Niro's character would have done as a saxophonist into the 1950s. And he had this idea that he would have gone to Paris. And then, so that idea sort of evolved into the movie Around Midnight, which Irwin Winkler produced, that came out in I think it was 1986. Robert De Niro's not in it. It's like completely new characters, but it's sort of that movie sort of evolved from New York, New York. But this movie, New York, New York, it's got the very famous Kander and Ebb songs in it. The songwriting duo behind the songs in Cabaret that Liza Minnelli sang in Cabaret, and this movie's got the title song New York, New York, which became a standard and is probably most famously known for being in the repertoire of Frank Sinatra. Although I think I probably prefer Liza Minnelli's version. So here we've got a sort of a reproduction of the film's original poster. The OB strip is sort of getting in the way there, but yeah, I'm very happy to have this. I think this film was actually quite influential on La La Land. I think La La Land actually has a very similar plot. The jazz musician and the ingenue love story. But yeah. Also, Clarence Clemens from the E Street Band is in New York, New York. He plays one of Jimmy Doyle's friends and sort of jazz colleagues, and it's a pretty good performance. He's good in this. This is a 1998 Japanese laserdisc from MGM Home Entertainment for Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, the film from 1956. So this is an early Kubrick film. You can sort of see Kubrick's face on the OB strip there. This is a really good Kubrick film. It's one of it's sort of a Kubrick film that's, I guess, in a sense, relatively uncontroversial amongst cinephiles. Like, it's a sort of a Kubrick film that most cinema buffs really like. It's not as contentious as some of his later films, I think. So it's a very good film. Sort of a crime movie. It stars the great Sterling Hayden, heading a really good cast. The screenplay's by Kubrick and novelist Jim Thompson, based on the novel Clean Break by Lionel White. It's a very interesting movie. It's sort of influential in a way because it's got this a sort of a heist that goes wrong, like a racetrack robbery, and it's what happened and all the recrimination and the betrayal and double crossing and the sort of the non-linear storytelling techniques. It's a very strong influence on Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. Being from 1998, this is I guess relatively more recent than most of the other laserdiscs I've been looking at. I think like towards the end of the late 90s, it's kind of entering the dying days of the format. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the 1988 Robert Zemeckis film. This is a 1989 Japanese laserdisc from Touchstone Home Video. This is a longtime favorite of mine. I absolutely love this movie. I saw it during its original theatrical run in 1988 in a cinema in Fremantle. And I've watched it many times since then on television, on home video, etc. I think it's a really good movie. This was directed by Robert Zemeckis. He did this. This is in between Back to the Future and Back to the Future Part 2. So Zemeckis directed the live action material. The animated material was directed by Richard Williams. And so this is it's got that very it's got a great cast. Bob Hoskins, Christopher Lloyd. The voices of Charles Fleischer and Kathleen Turner. It's just a great, very imaginative movie. It was sort of revolutionary at the time. It wasn't the first film to integrate animation and live action, so you had real people interacting with animated characters. It wasn't the first film to do that, but it was the first film that kind of, due to the filmmaking techniques at the time, it sort of made it much more believable in much more efficient. It's just a very, very well made movie, very funny. Just a great movie all around. And it did win some Academy Awards as well. Incidentally, I do remember Who Framed Roger Rabbit as being one of the few good movies that we got to watch in primary school, and that's because in fifth grade in 1991, my teacher let me bring it in. So yeah, I think we spent however long it was, half a day or whatever, watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So I can't remember if anyone thanked me for that, but they should have. One of the things that's still pretty unique about Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the cross company aspect of it. So the film is set in Hollywood of 1947, like an alternate reality Hollywood where humans and animated cartoon characters sort of live side by side. And the film was released by Touchstone, which is a subsidiary of Disney. So it's essentially a Disney production, but it features cartoon characters from not only Disney, but also from Warner Brothers and from other studios. So, I mean, you've got the famous sequence, the dueling piano sequence between Daffy Duck and Donald Duck. And then later on, you've got Bugs Bunny sharing the screen with Mickey Mouse. You've got Disney characters, and you've got the classic Warner Brothers characters like Tweety and Yosemite Sam, and then you've got characters from other studios like Droopy from MGM and Betty Boop from the Fleischer Studios. So it's like we will never see characters from different companies like that sort of all appearing in the same production. We'll probably never see that ever again, and that's another reason why this film is quite interesting if you're a fan of classic animation. Yeah, it's one of the best things about this movie, and also the performance by Bob Hoskins. I mean, I think we take it for granted these days when pretty much every high-profile A-list actor is expected to be able to act in a green screen with characters that'll be digitally imposed later on. But Bob Hoskins is really good in this, acting against cartoon characters that were added later on, especially since he adapts a very matter-of-fact attitude towards the characters, and it sort of gets disgruntled by them as well. Like, he doesn't play up to it. He just deals with it in a very, I say realistic, like, in the context of the story, a very realistic way. The other significant human actor in this movie is Christopher Lloyd, who plays the villain Judge Doom, and it's a really good performance, a typically mad performance by Christopher Lloyd. He had played villains before, Commander Krug in Star Trek 3 in 1984, but his previous work for Robert Zemeckis was, of course, as Doc Brown in Back to the Future, which is a very unvillainous performance. But Christopher Lloyd is good in this. There's the famous sequence where he unveils his toxic chemical, the dip, which is used to kill toons, and he sort of cold-bloodedly murders a little squeaking cartoon shoe, which apparently a lot of children at the time was sort of traumatized by that sequence. I never was, which means I'm not saying the scene's not not effective. Maybe I was just a little sadist myself, and who can say. Another Warner home video here. This is the 1988 Japanese Laserdisc of Network, the 1976 movie written by Paddy Chayefsky and directed by Sidney Lumet. So yeah, this is a very good looking release. All-star cast: Faye Dunaway, William Holden, Peter Finch, Robert Duvall. Ned Beatty has a really riveting moment in this as well. So this is a very prescient social satire on the media and network television and infotainment. Things that are quite commonplace now, but in the 1970s, this movie was sort of it was pointing to which way things were going to go. It's got Peter Finch, who won a posthumous Academy Award for his performance in this film as Howard Beale, the deranged newscaster who has that famous rallying cry, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." So yeah, I like this movie. I don't know if I'm entirely sold on this movie as a lot of people are. I mean, it's got things about it that kind of bug me. There's a lot of dialogue between Faye Dunaway and William Holden, which is kind of clever, but I find kind of annoying, where they sort of discuss their relationship in in terms of it, like it's a drama. It's sort of like a sort of a metatextual commentary. I have read someone once saying that they should have stopped making movies after Network because this has the most perfect screenplay and it could never be beaten. I don't really agree with that. I do like this movie, but I think at a certain point in this film, you kind of get worn down by Paddy Chayefsky's kind of cantankerous, like sort of disliking of almost everyone and everything. Especially he seems to have this very sort of grudging view of young people that comes across in this movie. I mean, maybe not. That's just my memory of it. But I should watch this again and maybe I'll find something new. And I mean, I sound like I'm kind of dumping on Network, which I really don't want to do. It is a good movie, and it was quite. The year that it was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, it was a sort of a famously stacked lineup. It was up against, for Best Picture Network, it was up against Hal Ashby's Bound for Glory, Alan J. Pakula's All the President's Men, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, and Rocky, and Rocky is the film that won. Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter from 1978. This is a 1990 Warner Home Video from, you guessed it, Japan. The Deer Hunter. This is. I haven't actually seen The Deer Hunter for quite a long time, really. It's sort of a controversial film. It was it won Best Picture. It was sort of, Michael Cimino he directed movies before, but he'd sort of come out of nowhere and sort of became this, this big sensation. And then there was a bit of a backlash against this movie. So it's about a group of steelworkers from Pennsylvania in the 1970s who go and fight in Vietnam, and it's sort of about the personal and physical fallout from when they return and picking up the pieces of their lives afterwards. So I think there were after this film had come out and won awards and everything, there was a lot of accusations that the film was racist, that it's the famous sequence of Americans being forced to play Russian roulette by sort of insane animalistic North Vietnamese, that was there was never any recorded instance of any of that happening. It was just made up. And then there was all this stuff about Michael Cimino. I think he claimed he was a combat medic in Vietnam, and it was turned out he sort of like was just making up. He just made that up. So the knives were out for Cimino, and that kind of set the stage for what happened when he made Heaven's Gate after this. But this is. I don't think this movie can be dismissed. It's really good. It is a bit self-indulgent. It sort of starts off with that wedding sequence that sort of just goes on for a while. But it's a sort of movie that in a sense we'll never really see anymore. And it's got such a fantastic cast. You got Robert De Niro, John Cazale, John Savage, Meryl Streep, Christopher Walken, who I'm pretty sure won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for this movie. So we've got a gatefold. So that looks all right. I mean, it's sort of, I guess if you go into this expecting a Vietnam movie, along the lines of Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, it's not that. But it's an interesting film, and it probably I'm probably way overdue to give this another viewing. This is a 1986. LaserDisc from Toho Video Disc from Japan for Solaris, the 1972 science fiction film directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. So it's kind of sort of got old book smell, this LaserDisc, but who cares? It's vintage. So Solaris, this is a very interesting movie, very influential. It's an adaptation of the 1961 novel by Stanislaw Lem. It's a very it's still a movie that kind of looks like no other movie. It's very meditative, very unique. It's got some interesting visuals. It's very as a sort of a cerebral, contemplative science fiction movie. It's very interesting. In some respects, it's a movie it's easier to admire than enjoy per se. But you have to watch it. So it's about a psychologist who travels to a space station orbiting the planet Solaris, sort of investigating what's going on there, and it's to do with like alien contact, but it approaches the subject in a way that's very different than what you would get in like an American film. Like it sort of plays up the intangibility of alien life a lot more. So I would love to see this movie on the big screen. Unfortunately, I've got the Criterion Blu-ray, but I've never seen it on the big screen. So yeah, I mean, I'm a big Andrei Tarkovsky fan. I think his 1979 movie Stalker, I think is his best movie. That's a movie. That's a sort of a genre-defying movie. That's just, I watched Stalker, and I honestly felt like the chemicals in my brain were being reorganized at a fundamental level. It was a very weirdly moving, transformative experience watching Stalker. But Solaris is a good movie too. It was remade in 2002 by Steven Soderbergh. I haven't watched that version. I do have it on DVD, but I haven't watched it. I don't imagine it would be as good as this, because Tarkovsky's Solaris, it really is a one of a kind movie that I think would be very, very difficult to replicate. Andrei Tarkovsky was a great Russian filmmaker. He directed 7 feature films between the 1960s and the 1980s, and they're all romanticist and intellectual to varying degrees. Films like Solaris and Stalker are more metaphysical, but all of his films are very beautiful, very meditative. And if you are interested in Tarkovsky, I heartily recommend everything he's directed. All 7 of his films have been released in pretty good Blu-ray editions by various companies. This is a 1984 Japanese Laserdisc from Warner Home Video for The Right Stuff, the 1983 movie directed by Philip Kaufman. This is a very good film, The Right Stuff. It's about the Mercury 7 astronaut program in the 1960s, so it's to do with the space race and America, competing with Russia in the extraorbital space exploration and such. So it's based on the 1979 nonfiction novel by Tom Wolfe. William Goldman was originally going to write the screenplay for this, but he had some disagreements with Philip Kaufman. I think there were some aspects that Philip Kaufman didn't like about Goldman's approach to the material. So the finished movie is credited as being written and directed by Philip Kaufman. It was produced by Robert Chartoff and Irwin Winkler, the same guys who produced New York, New York, incidentally. It's got a really good cast. It's it's an interesting movie. I mean, it's got it's kind of funny in a way. It's got some like sort of amusing vignettes in it, some great sort of like character moments in it. But it's it's still a really good movie about, I guess, a kind of a very pivotal and very interesting moment in American and indeed world history. So let's have a look at here. Yeah, so I really do like these Warner gatefold Laserdiscs. They just look really good, don't they? Yeah. So this is a long movie, but it's a good movie. It's got some really good scenes in it. Philip Kaufman is I think he's a very underrated filmmaker. He's made some really, really good films, and this might be his best film. It's one of the best American films of the 1980s, I think. That being said, I really do like Philip Kaufman's 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I really like The Wanderers from 1979 as well. So, yeah, actually, I don't think I can definitively say that The Right Stuff is, my favorite Philip Kaufman film or the best Philip Kaufman film. He's directed a lot of good stuff. Incidentally, I think one of the reasons why William Goldman wasn't involved in this was because he wanted to delete the character of Chuck Yeager, the test pilot who wasn't one of the Mercury 7 astronauts, but whose his test flights in breaking the sound barrier, which was important to the program and features quite heavily in Tom Wolfe's book. I think William Goldman didn't want to include Yeager, and Philip Kaufman did. So I think that's one of the reasons for the divergence that developed between Goldman and Philip Kaufman. I think that was the right call by Kaufman, because Chuck Yeager, who's played by Sam Shepard in the film, it's I don't think the film would work without him. And the cast is really good. I mean, you've got Scott Glenn, Ed Harris, Dennis Quaid, Fred Ward, Lance Henriksen. It's a really really good performances all around. So that's it for this time. There is obviously a lot more to come, but I'll try and keep the bad impromptu Robert De Niro impersonations to a minimum in any future installments.